Now what I'd like to discuss is something called collision shape. Now, if you're familiar with creating graphics with tools like Photoshop or Illustrator or any other image editing package, then you're going to understand a little bit about transparencies and bounding boxes. So this video might seem a little bit simple for you, but if you're not familiar with this, let's take a moment to look at each one of the shapes that I've been working with here so far in this project. We can see that we have a few actors, which of course were images that we brought in and turned into actors. We have this kind of perfectly circular image, this kind of blobby image, which is kind of a random shape, and then we have a few block type images. So before we get into collision shape, let's just take a look at these images in their original state inside Photoshop, because here inside GameSalad, these are all PNGs with transparency. So what does this all mean? Well, if we jump into Photoshop, you can see that this first circular shape that we have here fits within this bounding box. So you see this checker pattern here? This is the transparent area. So what am I trying to point out here? GameSalad is only going to pay attention to the bounding box of your image, which means that when this piece of artwork is inside GameSalad, GameSalad is not able to understand that this transparent area is not an area that you'd want to actually collide with. So it's actually going to be colliding with this entire box that we see right here, which for this circle actually poses a bit of a problem, because if we had another actor over here, we'd want it to actually come in contact with the circle and not the edge of the bounding box. So that poses a problem when we're working with this circle shape. But if we were to look at our block, you can see that our block fits the bounding box perfectly. Now all images are square or rectangular in shape, but the artwork inside the image might not fit that bounding box perfectly. In this case, the block does fit that bounding box perfectly, so if anything were to come in contact with this block, it would look like it was actually touching the block. Where again, if we go back to our ball, it's going to kind of touch the edge here, but not look like it's coming in contact with the ball or circle shape that we have. Again, don't get confused by this. I'm going to demonstrate it in a moment inside GameSalad. So let's take a look at our blobby character and try to analyze what would happen here. So if I had another actor moving across the screen and it were to try to come in contact with our blobby actor, well, it would look like it would kind of touch this little arm that we see here because it's at the very edge of the bounding box. Same thing with the legs that we see down here. It would kind of look like the legs were coming in contact with other actors, and of course over here on the left hand side. But if we had an actor moving across the screen and it were to try to come in contact with our blobby character over here, then it would kind of smash into the bounding box, and then it would look like our character wasn't actually touching this actor, and there's this invisible force field, which of course is the bounding box that I've been talking about, which is always rectangular in shape. So GameSalad has two collision shapes that you can actually work with, and if I double click on an actor and go to the physics pull down again, you can see that we have this option here called collision shape, and by default all collision shapes are set to rectangles, but we can actually switch this over to a circle. So let's clean up our scene here for a little bit and now start demonstrating how this all works. So I'm just going to bring my ground actor back in, and I will take my block character, put it down there, double click on the block character, and I'm going to add in that move behavior again. So I'll just scroll down to move, drag that into my block, and then we're going to have him move to the right at 300. And I'm going to take ground 2, and we're going to put that somewhere there. And if we preview this, we can see our block moves along and then bumps into ground 2. And if I zoom in here, you can see that the connection really works out. That's exactly where it seems like these two actors are touching each other perfectly. And that's again because if we analyze our block here inside Photoshop, you can see that there is no empty space around the image. The artwork fits the bounding box perfectly. and that's why we see a perfect connection. And the same is true with the ground actor as well. You can see that the ground image fits the bounding box perfectly. Unlike the circle and the blobby image, they don't fit the bounding box perfectly because they can't, because they're not perfectly rectangular. So let's go ahead and do the exact same thing now, but let's get our ball actor to move across. So of course we are going to drag in the move behavior. We'll keep that set so that our circle or ball moves to the right. And of course we can't forget to drag in the collide behaviors. Otherwise our little ball here will go right through each one of those ground surfaces. So we'll just switch this to ground, and then I'm going to duplicate this by holding the Alt key, and we'll switch this to ground too so it impacts both. And then I'm going to drag my ball actor here. And I want to try to get this just perfectly right. So we'll do something like that. I'm going to hold the Shift key and then push the right arrow to move this ground block over. That way I don't move it up or down. I want to get it aligned perfectly. And let's preview this. So you can see, actually, there's a few things that I want to switch up here. Again, let's not forget that bounciness and fixed rotation, as we learned in an earlier video. And let's preview this. Okay, so if I were to zoom in here, you can see that our circle moves across and it actually collides with this block, this second block actor, but you can see that they're actually not touching each other. So hopefully you've been able to understand what I've been talking about here inside Photoshop. Again, if we look at the ball actor, there's all of this empty space here that's actually going to come in contact right here. And it's actually easy to visualize because if we were to jump into our stage here before we preview, and we were to click on our ball actor, you can see that empty space right there that is coming in contact with the ground. Now, what we can do is we can switch our collision shape for the ball. So I will double click on the ball actor. Again, in the physics pull down, we're going to switch this from rectangular over to circle. And then if we preview this, you can see we get a much better representation at these impact points. So essentially what GameSalad has done, if we go back into Photoshop, is it's drawn its own circle inside the bounding box. It doesn't mean that it's paying attention to the pixels in the image, it's just drawn a circle, and in this case, because our circle fits to the edges of the bounding box, the circle that GameSalad draws is pretty accurate. Now, let's do this exact same thing now with our blobby character. So I'm just going to delete this guy from our scene. Let's jump into our blobby character. Let's jump into the physics, and of course we want to take the bounciness down to 0. We're going to turn on fixed rotation. We are going to drag the move behavior in one more time. Keep that moving to the right, and then of course we need our collides. So we'll drag in collide and make sure our blobby character is colliding with ground and ground 2. We'll bring this guy into our scene. And then I'll preview this. And you can see again, just like we had an issue with the ball character, our blobby character moves over to the right. And then when he comes in contact with the ground, his bounding box actually comes in contact, but the image, the actual pixels inside the image, don't have any sort of effect. GameSalad's not paying attention to any of the artwork that you have inside that bounding box. It's only paying attention to the bounding box, which we can see here. And of course, we can see all that empty space inside the bounding box. And again, as I pointed out in Photoshop, if we were trying to come in contact with areas like this, it would look like it was touching because the artwork, of course, extends all the way to the end of the bounding box. Now, there is no collision shape for blobby guy. There's only rectangle or circle. So it's a bit unfortunate that we can't pay attention to the actual pixels inside the image, but we have to just either choose rectangular or circle and hope for the best results. So in this case, if I switch blobby guy by double clicking on him and change his collision shape over to circle, in this case also I'll get a better representation. I actually missed him altogether, so let's adjust this. Move this down a tiny bit. And then preview this. And you can see I get a little bit better of a representation, but it isn't perfect. So you have to keep these things in mind when you're working inside GameSalad, and also you have to keep these things in mind when you're actually creating artwork. Because if I were to jump into Photoshop and I were to crop this image and do something like this, and save this image out, so I'm just going to do a save for web. Save that onto the desktop so I can find it. We'll just call this ball 2. And then I will bring this into GameSalad. And make this an actor. And I'm just going to grab all of these attributes. So I'm just going to hold the Shift key from our ball, and I'm going to Command C to copy that. And then I'll go into ball 2 and then Command V to paste that. Just a quick way of copying and pasting attributes. Careful, sometimes that can actually create bugs, but I'm just being lazy for this video so I can speed things along for you. If I were to drag ball 2 into my scene now, it looks just like ball 1, but notice that the bounding box for ball 2 is so much larger. So if I were to hit preview now, you can see ball 2 really isn't coming in contact with the ground at all. And even if I were to change the collision shape to a circle, you can see ball 2 still isn't coming in contact with the ground at all. And again, that's because its collision shape is so much bigger, the bounding box is so much bigger, I should say, than the actual artwork that we see inside that bounding box. So again, I know this was a bit of a tedious video, and there was a lot to learn here. Don't be intimidated if you aren't familiar with these graphics at all. It's not a big deal, but when working with graphics, either free graphics that you've downloaded from the internet or the graphics that we provide for you, it's important to know that this collision shape exists, and you're just going to have to experiment with either the rectangle or the circle and see which one works best with your artwork.